there was the iframe approach where you could get the same basic functionality out of it. What you'd do is you'd create a hidden iframe that was 0 pixels so that the client wouldn't see it, or excuse me, the user wouldn't see it. And what you could do is you could write script in the page that could call functions in your iframe, and that could send data and receive data from the server, and it wouldn't update the main page. So you'd get Ajax-like functionality with an iframe. So let's take a look at Ajax now. Ajax is basically the XML HTTP request object, which is abbreviated XHR, which is just as hard to say. In Internet Explorer, it's implemented as an ActiveX object, which is going to change in Internet Explorer 7, where it's going to become a native object like it is in Firefox. As you can see on here, this is a simple instantiation example. You take a look at the object, and you see if it's an ActiveX object or if it's a native object, and you instantiate it like that. So, a very, very basic example Ajax request and handling a response. You create the object, you set up whether you want to do a get or a post in your target site, and you set your callback there as update page, and then you send off the request. And when the response gets back, it hits the callback function, and it checks for some state and everything to make sure it's fine. You've got a HTTP 200 response header, and then you pull the response text out of there. So, the real beauty of the XML HP request object versus the iframe. It's not restricted to HTML forms with your name value pair. You can set any arbitrary data you want. And it's asynchronous as well, so you can, whenever, you just send off your request, and whenever data finally makes it back, it hits a callback, and you're good to handle it. There are all types of downstream data you can use. You can use anything, really. We're going to take a look at a couple of these very briefly, because these slides are kind of boring. XML. So this is the traditional method of doing Ajax. Nobody really likes to do it because it's so heavy. There are much lighter ways to do it. Take an example of the client sending up a simple request here for a zip code lookup and get back some data in XML for some Seattle zip codes. So another way to do it is for the server to send back full JavaScript. Same client request, and the JavaScript comes back down from the server, which is plugged right into eval. JavaScript arrays. Same sort of thing. The server sends back JavaScript arrays, which then JavaScript that's already running in the page watches to see those arrays those arrays got modified, and it updates the DOM with the new data. JSON, the lightweight way to do Ajax, which in half the examples is just as heavy as XML, actually. Same request, and it looks a lot like JavaScript arrays, actually, but it's a little bit different. Microsoft Atlas, which actually looks like JSON. Like I said, these slides are a little bit boring. We're going to go through them quickly. Google Web Toolkit sends back data, looks similar to that. And upstream options. So your traditional method to do an upstream option was just a get, which is really lightweight, really quick, and really insecure, as we'll show later. Upstream option is post, which is what the DWR framework uses. In this case, they do a post with the data being your variables and the method name that you're going to call, and that gets invoked. SOAP. SOAP is similar to basically doing XML downstream in that it can be done, and there are some people who do it, but it's pretty heavy, so not many people do it, actually. XML, same thing. Traditional way to do it. When it's done upstream like this, it's called a REST web service, and it's pretty heavy, so there are other ways that you'd usually go about doing it. And let's take a look at the fun stuff, the bugs.
Thanks, Zane. Can I get a round of applause for Zane? This is his first major conference, and I am so proud. I'm sorry. Told myself I wouldn't do this, but. Okay, so we're going to talk about the bugs. So we'll talk a little bit about discovery and method manipulation. We'll give you some examples, some concrete examples. Like I said, playing with parameters in a web application is still an excellent web attack. This is the first attack and the latter attack. Who here ever bought anything off the web, perhaps between 1995 and 1999? Anybody? Did you actually pay the price that you were supposed to pay when you bought that? Anybody not pay the right price? I admit it, I got a really cheap TV once. And why did I get a cheap TV? It's because in 1996, if you opened up a web store, an e-store, or a click and mortar store, then you would have your shopping cart would work by having hidden fields that represented the cost of the actual items in the shopping cart, right? People don't make stupid mistakes like that anymore with parameter manipulation, but they still make mistakes because the business logic and applications now are much, much more complicated, and so there are a lot of really complicated ways you can twist it. For example, here is something that may not look like parameter manipulation unless you think about it a little bit. This is let's say this is a normal Web 1.0 application, and I'm doing a GET request to do a transfer of money. Obviously, I probably need more information here, right? But the amount is this number. Anybody know what that number is? Does that look familiar to anybody? Any idiot savants in here? What? It's not a phone number. Sorry? Okay, I guess idiot savants mumble a lot. Could you speak up, sir? That's 2 to the 31st plus 1, right? So I put that number into a web transfer money in my bank. What might happen? What might happen if somewhere, after the, maybe the function that tests whether I have enough money uses a signed integer, right? And so it casts that unsigned int to a signed integer and ends up being a negative amount of money, which was supposed to be filtered out earlier. And it says, sure, you have enough money because you have more than negative amount. And then it lets this transfer go through. This actually worked in a web pen test a couple years ago. So parameter manipulation actually still exists. Figuring out the hard part of parameter manipulation is finding all the parameters and figuring out what they do. Like I said before, that's a lot of work, and that's why you actually have to pay Sanctum a lot of money to buy their web app security scanners, because that's where a lot of the intelligence is to be able to pretend to be a human and walk through an application and find stuff. Sanctum can give me money later for that ad. But is it easier in Ajax? Well, sometimes it is. There are really kind of two broad categories of types of Ajax. Some people call this client SOA versus HTML++. The client SOA side is really a client-server proxy side. It's Ajax as a GUI in front of a web service, right? You do this in a situation, in this situation, your framework, your Ajax framework, looks at server-side code where some of the methods on the server side are tagged as, I want people to call this, right? I've got a function called transfer money in my Java code on my server side, and somehow I say to the framework, I want this to be called by the web. And so your framework code automatically goes through, and it tags those, and it makes them public, and then it generates a JavaScript proxy that then maybe even has functions of the same name that exists in the web browser, and then it's up to the developer to write like the formatting code in the web browser that talks to that Java proxy, right? So it's a lot like a web service. When you interact with a SOAP web service on any platform, the first thing you do is you create a SOAP proxy object, and you point it at a WSDL, and all the magic happens, and that proxy object now represents the server, right? So now I've got a little thing in my browser, and I pull the lever here, and it makes the lever pull over there magically. That's the idea of the proxy. And obviously, a proxy like that has to know the name of all the methods. Now, theoretically, you'd be able to write an Ajax framework that didn't give all that information up front before somebody logged in. It turns out nobody has, but that's theoretically what somebody could do possibly. And in those situations, discoveries is pretty darn easy, because in some place in your browser's memory, there's a list of all of the methods on the server, and a list of all of the, maybe not the types, but the number of arguments they take. The other kind of Ajax is called client-side rendering by some people, or HTML++. It's really just a way of making the HTML a little cooler, and a lot of times it's in a situation where the framework doesn't want you to have to do any work on the JavaScript, so it makes it all magically. This is how both Microsoft Atlas and Google Web Toolkit work. Often that there are functions, and you can dig through them, and sometimes you can't. And this is a much more complicated situation to find these functions, and we'll give you some real examples later. So let's talk about cross-site scripting. Who here knows what cross-site scripting is? Now, see, finally a question that if you don't raise your hand, that you're probably my wife in the front row. Wow, I'm married to a lot of people today, okay. So cross-site scripting is basically, the browser has a security model, right? And if you have script running in the silo of a web page, then theoretically it can only break out of that silo in very specific very specific situations, right? And the whole idea of cross-site scripting is, I want to get script into that silo. And the best way to do that in the good old days was I bounce that script off of the server that you're talking to, right? There's lots of ways that you could do cross-site scripting. Kind of the two generic real ways that people used a lot was to put a new script element into HTML, right? Like if I'm posting on my message forum where I discuss sports scores, but I put a script tag in there, and it gets put into the HTML later when it gets rendered server-side, then that comes up to Firefox, and it has no idea that that script element wasn't supposed to be there, right? I created a new script element. And then the other way that people saw a lot was in situations where user-controlled data, this would often be something like document.url, like the actual URL you're going to, where user-controlled data ends up getting automatically composited into tags, like normal HTML tags. And so you wouldn't have to add a whole script tag. You just break out with a quote sign and add like an on mouse over event or an on load event. In Web 2.0, it's a lot more complicated, right? Because it's not just HTML that comes down and static JavaScript. You got all kinds of stuff coming down. There are dozens of different ways you can do cross-site scripting in an Ajax application. We'll talk about one of them. But the real point of this is if you are either attacking or defending an Ajax application, it's up to you to understand what the downstream protocol is and what's dangerous in that downstream protocol. We'll use one example. So this is a pretty common Ajax mechanism. I go to my site, maybe it's a mapping site, and I do a normal HTTP GET on that when I type it in the URL, and I get a bunch of HTML, a bunch of JavaScript that downloads and loads itself into my browser, makes itself at home, and then when it feels like it, it does an asynchronous post up using the XML HTTP request object, and then asynchronously gets back JavaScript. And then when it gets that JavaScript, it evals it. It just runs the JavaScript. And the whole idea of doing that is often you're either using that JavaScript to create data structures that are then looked for from different parts of the JavaScript, or it's a callback. And I can declare in that callback, maybe this asynchronous XML post is, I want to get the latitude and longitude for where I'm looking on the map. And the function that comes back is print latitude and longitude, right? So it's a great way of making state go with the request because the JavaScript that comes back knows what it's supposed to do. It's very, very common. In this case, maybe we're doing downstream JavaScript arrays. So now we've got attacker-controlled input being sent down in JavaScript arrays, which is dangerous. And in this situation, maybe I've got a form field that gets shown on somebody else's site, and it has to get down as a JavaScript array. And so everything that's read here is something that I control. And what I've done as the bad guy is I've given it an item to put in this downstream array. Maybe it needs to not be null or empty, so it works. And then close off with the double quote, close off the quotes that are already put there by the JavaScript. And then I terminate the line and actually do a whole nother JavaScript function. It would be very, very convenient if this web site I'm attacking had something called do bad stuff that did something bad for me. Most likely that would have to be something much more complicated to actually do whatever payload, whatever bad thing you want to do. And then you close it off and you create a new variable so that you can have those quotes and that semicolon at the end actually mean something. And this gets run intentionally by the browser, right? Why do I care about the quotes and stuff? Well, whatever I do, and one of the things that makes this complicated is I absolutely don't want to break the JavaScript, right? Because the eval is going to break and the whole thing's going to break down, and they're just going to get an error. They might not know they were ever attacked, but your payload's not going to run. And as you can see, lots of stuff that people used to look for, like brackets and script and on mouse over and all the kinds of things people used to have in their XSS blacklists, doesn't have to exist anymore because I'm already injecting stuff into a running JavaScript engine. And so the domain of characters is much, much larger. What if this was, instead of an array like this, a custom serialization where the pipe object is instead of equals, right? Which actually you see situations like this, or some unprintable character, or it's a semicolon, or they pick